This police officer didn't just break the law, he wanted to become the next Heisenberg and recreate Breaking Bad. Daniel Ameson started his career in the police force in 2002 with good intentions. He wanted to fight crime and put the bad guys away. He lived a pretty normal life in Wigan with his wife Rachel. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until he became seriously injured in a crash at work. And this was such a bad crash that he ended up wheelchair bound for 3 months. And he really struggled to cope with this. He had pretty bad mental health. He just felt like while he was injured, honestly, he didn't get the respect that he deserved. He grew very resentful of senior members of staff that he felt just weren't treating him very well. And he had a lot of time on his hands recovering from his injuries and was watching Breaking Bad. My favorite series, by the way. I love Jesse Pinkman. If you've been living under a rock and you don't know what Breaking Bad is, basically the main character, Walter White, is a school teacher, and he ultimately turns to crime and creating substances, if you get what I mean, in order to pay for medical bills. And this gave Daniel an idea. Why don't I make some extra money for myself? Turns out his job as a policeman actually gave him access to other people's ID. Specifically, the confiscated driving license of this random guy. So he took that license and posed as this random bloke in order to rent out to properties. And he turned these homes into CBS properties, if you know what I mean. He was growing so many substances, it was making him hundreds of thousands of pounds. And he ended up getting incredibly cocky with it. He honestly saw himself as Walter White. He got a bunch of other men involved, including his brother-in-law Richard. It became like a real family venture. He was rocking about in this Heisenberg t-shirt. Honestly, it was quite comical. He felt like the sky was the limit. He had big plans to expand the business. And it felt like he thought he would never get caught. But his confidence made him complacent. Soon word was getting out about his little side hustle, about his double life, and people tipped this off to his colleagues. When the force investigated, they realised that he was living this crazy double life as, honestly, police officer turned gang lord. He was immediately sacked and police seized over £22,500 from his family home. Daniel and 7 other men were jailed in 2017. Daniel got just over 6 years. But his life of crime did not end there, because police found out that he was actually selling illegal boxes for TV. He then admitted to conspiracy to commit fraud and was given an extra year behind bars.
He sliced off his own lip using a box cutter, gouged out the moles in his face, and even gave himself a nose job, all to try and change his appearance so that he wouldn't get caught for the horrific murder of this young woman. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Lindsay Hawker. Lindsay was born in Coventry in December 1984, and she was a very well-liked young woman. She was smart, she was ambitious, she was funny, adventurous, and outgoing. And when I say smart, I mean she was really smart. She graduated from the University of Leeds with a first-class honours in biology. She wanted to become a doctor, a GP specifically, and she was more than capable of doing this. Once Lindsay had her mind set on something, she was going to accomplish it no matter what. Before committing to her masters, Lindsay decided that she was going to take a gap year from university. She wanted to go out and experience the world a little bit and do a little bit of travelling. She had always had an interest in Japan, and because this was considered a very safe place to travel, she decided that that is where she was going to go. In October 2006, 22-year-old Lindsay Hawker jumped on a plane and moved to the other side of the world. She settled in the Kyoto region of Tokyo, where she managed to get a job teaching English within a very prestigious private school. She kept in touch with her loved ones back at home through social media, through Skype, email and phone calls, and every time she just boasted about how much of an amazing time she was having. Lindsay was loving Japan. She was obsessed with it, the people, the culture, the lifestyle. She couldn't get enough and she was having the best time. On the 20th of March 2007, Lindsay had just finished a shift at work and was making her way home on the train. Unbeknownst to her, she was being watched. After getting off the train and going to retrieve her bike, she would be approached by 28-year-old Tatsuya Ichihashi. Tatsuya called out to Lindsay and said that she was his English teacher, but Lindsay knew all of her students and she didn't recognise this man. She tried to palm him off and politely make him go away, but he wasn't taking the hint. So Lindsay climbed on her bike and began to cycle home, but Tatsuya began to follow her. He chased her even as she began began to pedal faster and faster to try and get away from him. He was sprinting behind her. Tatsuya would follow Lindsay all the way back to her apartment, and once he got there, he even had the neck to collar her again and ask if he could have a glass of water. And being the kind person that she was, feeling sorry for this man, Lindsay allowed him inside. She would make sure, however, to walk past her 2 roommates. This was in part so her roommates could see him and get a good look at his face, and so that he knew that she didn't live alone. While Tatsuya was drinking the glass of water, he managed to convince Lindsay to give him English lessons, and he would pay her the equivalent of around about £32 an hour. They started to plan when and where they would have this first lesson when Tatsuya pulled a notebook out of his pocket. He quickly scribbled something down and passed the note over to Lindsay. He had drawn a rough sketch of Lindsay and signed it with his name and phone number and passed it to her. On the 25th of March, Tatsuya and Lindsay would meet up in a cafe where Lindsay was going to give him a 1-hour English lesson. This is something that is very typical. They got finished at around about 9:45 a.m. and that is when Tatsuya told Lindsay that he had accidentally forgotten to bring his money, but he only lived down the road, so if Lindsay came with him to his apartment, he would be able to pay her. And she wanted paying, so of course she went with him. The two would jump into a taxi and arrived at Tatsuya's apartment. Lindsay actually had work that day. She was scheduled to be in at 10:50 a.m. and so she asked the taxi driver who took them to the apartment if he would wait there just a couple of minutes. She was going to be right back so he could take her directly to work. The taxi driver agreed and he would wait for 7 minutes before driving away. When Lindsay didn't return home that evening, her flatmates began to worry. However, after she missed 2 shifts of work at the school, they contacted her parents, who then contacted the police to report her missing. Officers arrived to Lindsay's home and began speaking to her flatmates. I do also believe that they had contacted the police, but the report wasn't taken seriously until Lindsay's parents also made a report. They would tell the officers about the meeting that Lindsay had scheduled at that cafe, and even better, they already had a lead for them to follow. They handed over the officers the drawing that Tatsuya had done of Lindsay. Using this, the police were quickly able to track him down and arrived at Tatsuya's apartment. A total of 9 officers would actually show up there, and when they knocked on Tatsuya's door, he opened it and immediately bolted out. He sprinted. He sped past all 9 officers and he actually got away. When they tried to reach out to grab hold of him, all they were able to do was pull off his rucksack that was full to the brim of cash, and he ran away from all 9 of them wearing no shoes. After him running away, he completely disappeared. He dropped off the face of the earth. When the officers made their way inside of the apartment, they would walk into a scene of complete disarray. It was blatantly obvious that a struggle had happened in here. On the balcony, the officers would notice that Tatsuya had physically pulled his bath from his bathroom out to the balcony, and inside of it, there was the body of Lindsay Hauger. She had sustained severe bruising all across her body. Bruises that were on her face were described as being egg-shaped and sized and were consistent with being punched in the face. Other bruises on her body were consistent with her colliding with furniture. She had been severely beaten, raped, gagged, bound, and then strangled to death. She had been strangled with so much force that her neck actually snapped. Following the murder, Tatsuya would shave off all of Lindsay's hair, and it was rumoured that he had shaved off the hair because he wanted to make a wig to wear the hair himself. He would then place Lindsay's naked body into the bath with a mixture of sand and soil. He then sprayed it with some sort of chemical with the hopes of speeding up decomposition. Japanese police began their investigation into Lindsay's murder and trying to track down Tatsuya. However, Lindsay's family were furious with the progress that they were making. They were pulling their tails between their legs and barely making any progress at all. Lindsay's dad herself would fly all the way to Japan to bring awareness to Lindsay's case and try and get the ball moving with the investigation, and he even consulted with the mafia trying to get their help. Tatsuya would be on the run from authorities for a total of 2.5 years, going all over Japan. In order to disguise himself from all of the wanted posters, his face was plastered everywhere, and in some places they even had life-size cardboard cutouts of him. So in order to try and conceal his identity, he mutilated himself. Using a box cutter, he would cut away at his bottom lip. He gouged out some of the prominent moles in his face, and he even stitched his own nose to try and give himself a homemade nose job. He would work odd jobs here and there, and with his wage from these odd jobs, he would save up to get proper plastic surgery. And this is how he was finally discovered. A doctor that he saw was very concerned or found it weird that he had gouged out the moles in his face, and he asked Tatsuya if he could take a photo of it. He told Tatsuya that it was for a before and after photo, but this doctor just found it so suspicious that he actually sent the photos to the police. They would confirm that that was the face of Tatsuya, a man they had been hunting down for over 2 years who was wanted for murder. After learning that the police had discovered his identity and were just about to track him down, Tatsuya tried once again to flee. However, he would be intercepted at a ferry port. When asked his identity, he admitted who he was and was quickly arrested. He would go on to be convicted of the murder of Lindsay Hawker and received a sentence of life imprisonment.
Here's the Lucy Letby theory no one ever talks about, and it genuinely did happen in another case. It was 2022 in Dallas, Texas. Reynaldo Rivera Ortiz Jr. was an anesthesiologist working at Surgicare North Dallas. Now, he actually had a pretty dodgy background, certainly not the type of doctor that I'd want performing any kind of procedure on me, but then again I doubt his patients knew. Back in 1999 he was arrested for allegedly assaulting his then wife, and then when they broke up and he got a new girlfriend, he started doing the same thing to her. She ended up having to get a protective order against. But I'm actually not done, because again in 2014 he was arrested, this time for shooting his neighbour's dog. Like, why was this man not in jail for the love of baby Jesus? He just carried on working as a medical professional. It just defies belief. And nobody had any idea just how dark things were going to get. Reynaldo was really not good at his job at all. In May 2022, during a very normal routine surgery, one of his patients stopped breathing. He ended up getting investigated for A, not keeping a patient ventilated, which was like the bare minimum, and B, not documenting critical events. And he was absolutely raging about being investigated. He thought this made him look really bad, which it did. So he came up with a sickening plan. Instead of somehow trying to make this right by, maybe taking on some extra study hours or do a training course, he plotted to sabotage everybody else's patients too. He was like, if I can just make them look equally bad, it'll kind of take the attention off me. Not considering, or maybe just not caring, how fatal that could be. Following month, one of Reynaldo's colleagues, Dr. Melanie, started feeling really unwell at work. She decided to take home like an IV fluids bag from the hospital so that she could treat herself at home for dehydration. But immediately when she hooked herself up, she realized something was very, very wrong. She called an ambulance, but before they'd even arrived, she was dead. And straight away, this was classed as a very suspicious death. What was in that IV bag? Well, it turned out it had been tampered with. And it came to light that just a bunch of other really weird things had been going on at the hospital, like unexpected cardiac emergencies. These were happening weirdly in really routine procedures. It wasn't making sense. One was even just an 18-year-old boy having routine sinus surgery. So a lab got to work analysing this IV bag to see what the hell was inside. They found bupivacaine, among other substances, along with a puncture in the bag. Someone had done this on purpose. And suspiciously, the only person that didn't seem to be at the centre of any of these medical emergencies was Dr. Reynaldo. So they were like, right, let's scour the hospital CCTV, see if we can catch anyone in the act. And sure enough, who did they find on the recordings keep scurrying back and forth from the warming bin where those IV bags were kept? Dr. Reynaldo, repeatedly in and out of the bin, mixing vials of medication and callously watching as his patients were wheeled past, knowing that they could potentially be killed. He was eventually found guilty of causing one death and numerous cardiac emergencies and was given 190 years in prison. Now, I'm not saying that's what happened in the Lucy Letby case, but I don't hear many people talking about the fact that she might have been framed.
When billionaires Barry and Honey Sherman were discovered unalived in the pool area of their basement, detectives couldn't help but notice they were posed exactly like these strange art sculptures that were also located in the same basement. I've had so many of you recommend this story to us, and I can't believe I had never heard it before because these details are chilling. This Toronto home belonged to pharmaceutical billionaire Barry Sherman, one of Canada's richest men. For nearly 30 years, he shared this home with his wife Honey, and they were both fixtures in Toronto's charity circuit. In 2017, they listed this home for just over $5 million. They were building a $25 million mansion in Forest Hill, one of the city's most exclusive enclaves. On the morning of December 15, 2017, their realtors arrived at the home with potential buyers. The buyers were headed to the pool area in the basement with the agents when the agents looked over and they discovered the bodies. The Shermans were on the far deck of the pool, slumped over. This illustration shows how they were found. They were seated side by side and they were fully clothed. They each had a man's leather belt wrapped around their necks, and the belts were attached to a metal pool railing that was about 4 feet high. Their arms were constrained behind their backs by their own jackets. So basically they had pulled the jackets down over their shoulders and they were behind their backs. I don't understand why they would have had jackets on inside their home. So again, here is a picture of these statues that were seated side by side in the same basement. Seeing the illustration and seeing these statues, do you think that they were posed this way on purpose? For reasons unknown, it took Toronto police years to release the security footage. It shows a man walking through the snow near the Shermans' home on the night of their murders. To this day, this man has never been identified, and to this day, I'll go ahead and say this case has never been solved. There was no sign of a break-in at the home, so investigators believe that either the perpetrator had a key, or they used that lockbox since the home was for sale, or the Shermans knew their assailant. The Shermans were last seen alive on December 13th, but they weren't found until 2 days later on December 15th. They did have a security system, but it wasn't high-tech. It didn't provide any footage that was useful in the investigation. I will also add, this might be the largest reward on a case that I've ever seen. The Sherman family is offering a $35 million reward for any information that leads to an arrest.
He's known as the truck stop killer. He was a trucker that abducted women and kept them shackled in the back of his truck that he renovated into a torture chamber on wheels. It's also very possible that he is one of the most prolific and deadly serial killers that you have likely never heard of. Just a little backstory so you know the kind of guy that we're dealing with. Robert Ben Rhodes was born during World War II, and his father was a soldier that was stationed overseas for the first few years of his childhood. And in his early years of childhood, he had a happy, normal childhood until his father returned home from war. His father was a violent, abusive man that treated his family horribly. After this, it was a very drastic change in Robert. He was acting out. He was getting in trouble with the law. He was even arrested twice before he even turned 18. After high school, Robert joined the Marines, but he was very quickly dishonorably discharged after getting caught committing an armed robbery. Back in his hometown, Robert is only 18 years old when his entire family just gets completely flipped upside down when his father was arrested for SAing a little 12-year-old girl. His victim would sadly never receive justice in the court of law because Robert's father brought an end to his own life before the trial began. Robert became very obsessed with BDSM and also attending swinger parties. He was really into like the whips and the chains and all of that. Some people in this community like a little consensual pain to feel a lot of pleasure, but Robert was very extreme and he did not care about consent. Robert is a textbook sadist that gets off on inflicting the most pain as possible, and with Robert, there was no safe word to get him to stop. The more his victims would cry out in pain, the more fun that Robert was having. Robert was married 3 times. His first 2 wives quickly left him, one with a child that he would never see again. His 3rd wife, Deborah, met Robert in a bar in Texas. When Robert met Deborah, he gave her a fake name. He called himself Dusty Rhodes. He also lied about his job. He was a trucker at this point, but he told her that he was a pilot. He was even wearing like a full fake pilot costume when he met her. After several months of dating, Deborah did finally learn the truth, but I guess this wasn't a deal breaker because the two did go on to get married. The marriage started out nice, but it quickly became very abusive. But Deborah was able to maintain being married to Robert because he was always out on the road being a trucker, but he started to force Deborah to attend these swinger parties that she did not want to be at. And it was actually at one of these parties that Deborah caught her husband SAing a girl that was passed out. So it was sometime after that Deborah finally escaped Robert. As a trucker, Robert committed some of the most horrific crimes imaginable. As a trucker during the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, Robert would be alone for a lot of time, like weeks or even months at a time, just him, his truck, and the open road. Robert began hunting and preying on very vulnerable young women. These would be travelers, hitchhikers, runaways, or young women that were escaping abusive situations. Robert would pretend to be really nice and he would offer them rides from truck stops or diners or alongside the highway. And once he had these young women in his truck, he would take out a weapon and then he would force them into the back of his truck. And in the back of Robert's truck, he had completely renovated it into a torture chamber on wheels. Robert would force these young women to strip down. He would then gag them, he would handcuff them, he would chain them up, and then he would shackle them by their wrists to the ceiling or to the wall. And he would keep them there for days, weeks, or even months. And whenever Robert felt like he needed a little break from driving, he would go into the back of his truck and he would inflict unimaginable pain on his victims. He would brutally assault them, he would SA them, and he would torture them. And whenever Robert had to stop for food, for gas, or to make a delivery, he would just turn up the music really, really loud in his truck so no one could hear his victims that are chained up in the back screaming. And while Robert is driving around with these girls in the back of this torture chamber he had in his truck, he would drive by thousands of cars a day that had no idea about the horrors going on inside of his truck. And the thought of that just absolutely terrifies me. Robert really liked to keep trophies from his victims. He would keep their personal belongings. He would take photos of them. He was really obsessed with shaving their body hair, if you know what I mean. And he was really into cutting his victims' hair, like really, really short, into pixie cuts, and then he would keep their hair. And whenever Robert got bored of his victims, he would tragically kill them, and then he would just dump their bodies off isolated back roads like they were trash. And because it was the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, there was no like nationwide database to track missing persons and Jane Does, so Robert was able to get away with everything. A young girl could run away from home in one state, and then Robert could pick her up in a different state. He could assault her, kill her in another state, and then dump her body in a completely different state. And then he could just get back on the highway, disappear into the sea of traffic with nothing to link him to his victims. In November 1989, a young newlywed couple, 26-year-old Douglas Zykowski and 24-year-old Patricia Candace Walsh, who went by Candy, left their home in Seattle to hitchhike to Georgia when they were picked up by Robert in Texas. Robert murdered Candy's husband Douglas within 4 hours of picking them up. He then forced her into the back of his torture chamber where he kept her there for over a week, repeatedly SAing her and torturing her before he tragically killed her and then dumped her body in Utah. Candy's body wasn't discovered for nearly a year, and it would take another 13 years to identify her. A few weeks later, Robert picked up an 18-year-old girl named Shanna Holtz in California. He kept her for 2 weeks before she escaped. She was able to tell the police everything about her kidnapper, what he looked like, that he went by the name Dusty Rhodes, what kind of truck he drove, and what company he worked for. Police called this company and they were able to link the Dusty Rhodes alias to Robert. They brought him in for questioning, but then he was released. Regina Walters was only 14 years old when she was kidnapped by Robert Ben Rhodes. Regina was suffering a lot in recent years after her older sister took her own life when she was only 12 years old. Regina got into a relationship with a much older boy. Regina was still only 14 years old, and Ricky Jones, Regina's boyfriend, was 18. Her family did not approve of the relationship, so the young couple ran away together and were sadly never seen alive ever again. After picking up the young couple, Robert killed 18-year-old Ricky and then left his body in Mississippi. He then kept 14-year-old Regina for over a month. He cut her hair into a pixie, he tortured her, and he SA'd her repeatedly. He would also call her parents to torment them about their missing daughter. After over a month, Robert led Regina to an abandoned barn in Illinois where he took these infamous final photos of Regina Walters. He killed her just moments after these photos were taken, and then he just left her body in the barn. On March 1st, 1990, a police officer was driving down I-10 in Arizona when he saw a trucker that was pulled over on the side of the highway. His intuition told him that something was wrong, so he pulled over. The officer spoke with Robert, and Robert seemed really, really calm and like everything was normal, so the officer thought that his intuition was wrong, and he started going back to his car to drive away. But just as this officer was about to leave, he started to hear the muffled screams of a woman coming from the back of Robert's truck. He opened Robert's truck and he found a young girl stripped down, shackled to the wall, covered in bruises. This final victim chose not to release her name to the public, but this young woman told officers that Robert told her while he was torturing her that he had been doing this to young girls for over 15 years. Robert was arrested for kidnapping an SA and he pled guilty and was sentenced to 6 years in prison. But the police and the FBI kept investigating because they knew that this man had more victims out there. In the back of his truck and in his home, they found a bunch of personal belongings that belonged to missing and murdered women across the entire country. They also found a bunch of photos of young women in distress and in pain that Robert took, as well as a bunch of human hair. Regina Walters' body was found in the barn that she was killed in September 1990, and they were able to link her murder to Robert from the photos that he took of her. Robert pled guilty to her murder to avoid the death penalty, and he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. 13 years after he killed the newlywed couple Candy and Douglas, their bodies were finally identified and linked to Robert. And after faced with the evidence of those crimes, he also pled guilty to avoid the death penalty and received 2 additional life sentences. A majority of serial killers, once they're caught, like to brag about their crimes and they make full confessions, but not Robert Ben Rhodes. Robert will deny everything until he is faced with indisputable evidence of his crimes, and then he will finally confess just to avoid the death penalty. The FBI was able to get a hold of some of Robert's trucker logs. Unfortunately, by the time they got there, the only logs available were from 1987 to 1990, but just in those 3 years alone, the FBI believes that they could link 50 to 75 missing and murdered women to Robert Ben Rhodes. That is 50 to 75 additional victims just in 3 years. But remember, Robert told his last victim that he had been doing this to women for over 15 years. And if that is true, that could potentially make Robert Ben Rhodes one of, if not the most prolific and deadly serial killer in American history, or possibly even in the entire world. But if Robert refuses to confess, we might never know just how many victims he had, meaning that there's potentially hundreds of victims' families that will live their entire lives without answers. Robert is still alive today and is 80 years old. Truckers are actually one of the most common jobs amongst serial killers, and the FBI believes that there's currently 850 unsolved murders that they believe were committed by truckers. And if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for listening to the victim stories in this case. Let me know all your thoughts and opinions in the comments, but while you're there, please remember to be respectful. Like I said, there's potentially hundreds of victims of this evil monster, so just please always remember to be respectful. And while you're in the comments, please let me know what case you want to see me cover next. Thank you to everyone that suggested that we cover this case, and I will see you guys all next time in my next video. Please be a good person to your fellow person.
They were dancing nonstop, sometimes for days, even weeks, and no matter what they tried, they just couldn't stop. It got so intense that some people ended up dying from strokes, heart attacks, or just pure exhaustion. They literally danced themselves to death. Over 500 years later, the dancing plague of 1518 still has people questioning what really happened. Yes, I will get into the theories about what may have caused this, but first, let me tell you about what happened. So this all started in July of 1518 with a woman named Frau Trophea in the city of Strasbourg in what is now modern-day France. One day, Frau just walks out of her house and starts dancing. No music, no reason, just dancing, and her husband is begging her to come back inside, but Frau couldn't stop. It was like she had no control over it. She continues to dance for hours until she collapses from exhaustion. She's drenched in sweat, her body is twitching, and she's clearly not doing well. But the very next morning, Frau is back at it, dancing again. Her feet are swollen and bleeding from the day before. She's hungry, thirsty, completely drained, but none of that stops her. By day 3, locals start gathering around to watch as Frau moves frantically with no music. She kept up this cycle for about a week, dancing until she collapsed, only to start again the next day. Most of the onlookers just assumed that Frau had sinned and her uncontrollable dancing was the work of the devil possessing her body. But soon the locals changed their theory. Instead of the devil, they started to think that Frau had angered Saint Vitus, who according to legend would curse people with uncontrollable dancing if provoked. With this being the most logical explanation explanation for the time, the local authorities picked her up, tossed her in a wagon, and brought her to the shrine of St. Vitus, hoping it would break the curse. But just a week after Frau started dancing, more than 30 other locals who had witnessed her strange behavior suddenly fell into the same uncontrollable urge to dance. And they were moving with such intensity, it seemed like the only way they'd stop is if they'd collapsed or died. People were dancing everywhere, in public halls, in their homes, no matter where they were, they just couldn't stop. Some were dancing for days on end, completely unable to control themselves. As more people were affected, the city officials were desperate to figure out what was happening. But coming up with an explanation for this was very tricky. There was the clergy, who believed it was the work of St. Vitus cursing the townspeople, and then there were the physicians who had a different theory. They claimed it was caused by a natural disease, blaming it on overheated blood in the brain. At the time, medical practices in this area were based on humoral theory, and if you're not familiar, this was a system of medicine that has its roots as far back as ancient Greece and was a prevalent medical practice throughout medieval and early modern Europe. The idea was that the human body had 4 main humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and keeping them in balance was key to staying healthy. If the humors were out of balance, you were sick. For example, too much blood might cause fever or, oddly enough, excessive enthusiasm. So naturally, physicians thought this wild non-stop dancing was caused by overheated or excessive blood. I just want to interject that it's hard to tell if this came about only after Paracelsus, a Swiss physician and alchemist, passed through Strasbourg in 1526, long after the dancing plague had concluded, and he started to throw around theories, but it kind of seems like the city officials at the time this was all going on came to a similar conclusion. They suggested that those who were affected just dance it out. So they turned markets and town halls into makeshift dance floors. Dozens of musicians and professional dancers were hired and brought in to keep the energy up, and reportedly people were paid to prop up exhausted dancers so they could keep going as long as possible or until they got the dancing out of them. But this plan completely backfired. Instead of stopping, even more people started dancing. Reportedly, as many as 400 locals were overtaken by this uncontrollable urge, and the entire dancing plague went on for nearly 2 months. People were collapsing from exhaustion, suffering heart attacks, strokes, you name it. One account even claims that at its peak, up to 15 people were dying every day, but other sources estimate that around 100 people lost their lives in total from dancing themselves to death. With no hope of people stopping, the town council basically ordered the dance floors and stages to be torn down. They banned almost all dancing and music in the city until September of that year, when the dancing pretty much just stopped. They were trying to put their foot down and discourage those from dancing in hopes it would stop, but public dancing was normal. There wasn't much to do in 1518, and celebrations like weddings and church events almost always involved dancing. So an exception was made. The local council basically said, if you want to dance to celebrate a wedding or church event, fine, but if you do it, you have to do it in your own home, and you can only dance to stringed instruments. Absolutely no tambourines or drums. It was believed that stringed instruments were less likely to trigger the dancing plague. The council also added that those who were most affected by the dancing plague had to be thrown into wagons and taken to the shrine of St. Vitus, where it was believed that weeks earlier, Frau Trophea had been cured. At the shrine, priests placed the still dancing individuals beneath a carving of St. Vitus, gave them small crosses to hold, and put them in red shoes, and went through this ritual that they believed would break the curse. It worked. Soon after, the dancing finally died down. So what actually caused the dancing plague? More modern theory is that ergot poisoning was to blame, the same thing that people believe may have triggered the Salem witch trials. Ergot is a toxic fungus that grows on damp rye stalks, and when ingested can cause hallucinations, muscle spasms, and bizarre behavior. It produces chemicals similar to what's used to synthesize LSD, so while it's not LSD, ergot poisoning can have similar effects. Some historians believe that the townspeople ate bread that was made from contaminated rye. The only issue with this theory is that ergot poisoning also severely restricts blood flow to the limbs, which would have made it challenging for people to dance as long and as hard as they were. Now, historian John Waller argued that while ergot may have played a role, he believed the dancing plague was actually a case of mass hysteria, which is essentially a phenomenon where a group of people experience similar physical or psychological symptoms with no identifiable physical cause. And it can be triggered by anxiety, fear, or stress within a community, and at the time, the people of Strasbourg were experiencing extreme poverty, disease, and starvation. Those horrific living conditions, coupled with the strong religious beliefs in St. Vitus's curse, could have made it possible for pure fear to cause these symptoms. If you genuinely believed you could be cursed with uncontrollable dancing, your mind might actually make it happen. And honestly, I think both theories could be true at the same time. Maybe ergot poisoning did play a part, but combined with mass hysteria and intense religious fear, it could have spiraled into something way bigger, something that led hundreds of people to dance uncontrollably and sometimes to the point of death. Let me know all of your thoughts in the comments. If you have a case like this you want me to cover, feel free to comment that as well. But thank you so much for sitting here and listening to this story. story, and I will see you in my next video.
4 kids were trapped in the middle of the Amazon jungle for 40 days with no food, no shelter, no grown-up, and somehow they all survived. And the whole reason they were even out there started in this tiny village in the Amazon. This woman, her name is Magdalena, is living there with her husband Manuel, but Manuel isn't exactly a safe, protective husband. He's known for being physically and verbally abusive, being involved in very illegal activity, and not treating Magdalena as a priority, which is really worrisome because it's not just Magdalena that's being treated like this, but also her children. They have 4 kids together. Leslie is 11, Solaney is 9, Tian is 4, and little Kristen is just 11 months old. But the 2 oldest, Leslie and Solaney, they are from Magdalena's previous marriage, which technically makes Manuel their stepfather. But because Manuel is not a good man and has really bad influences, the safety of their family and the town has been worsening every single day, so much so that he's been receiving dangerous threats. And so he decided, okay, let me flee my village, leaving my wife and kids behind so that I don't die. Which is like shocking, because how selfish can you possibly be? Just leaving your family to fend for themselves. And so Magdalena had no other choice but to follow Manuel, because the rebel group that was causing all of this violence in the town was also recruiting children. And that is a huge no. So her plan was to beg every day for one of the soldiers in her town to fly her and her children on a plane so that they can be reunited in a neighboring city with Manuel. And out of pure luck, one of the flights got canceled, which means that Magdalena was finally able to hop on board with 2 adults and her 4 kids. But there are 2 major problems. There is a massive rainstorm right above them, so we can all assume, oh, okay, they'll just wait it out with the navigation systems on board, right? Well, no, because the airplane is so old and in such bad condition, it isn't even considered safe enough to turn on, let alone fly through a rainstorm. I mean, the propeller, the wings, the engine, they're barely holding on by a thread, and this family is about to go soaring on it. Turbulence alone terrifies me, so imagine that. And let me tell you, these problems immediately started showing, because now it was time for the pilot to turn on the engine and move forward. But because they don't have an actual roadway, the ground is so muddy and rocky, the wheels start shaking so hard that it causes the propeller to bounce off the ground. I don't think OSHA would approve of this, but eventually the plane is finally lifted into the air and everything seems to be going pretty smooth. The storm has officially passed them, the skies are beautiful and blue, but for some unknown reason, something horrible happens to their engine. The pilot grabs the radio and calls air traffic control, yelling, "Mayday, Mayday, 2803, my engine is idling, I'm going to hit water." And a few seconds later, the airplane takes a sharp right turn, nosediving over 100 miles per hour straight into the ground below them. Half the plane completely bends in, there is metal cranking, there's debris everywhere, and then just silence. Leslie opens her eyes after blacking out from the impact, and she's terrified and confused, yelling for her mom. But as she lifted her head to look around, all she saw were the unalived bodies of the 2 pilots in horrific condition. They immediately died on impact, and all I can hope is that they felt no pain. And then a few seconds later, Magdalena and all the kids wake up, completely disoriented but still alive. Except something felt off, like Magdalena was feeling really sleepy and warm, which after a crash like that is not good news. And so she's looking around, looking at her kids, looking at this horrifying scene, and then she looked at herself. Magdalena's whole body is drenched in blood, except she can't tell why. Her brain hasn't connected the dots, except Leslie's did. She quickly fumbles through their bag and grabs a diaper, and then she reaches over to her mom and applies pressure, covering a gashing wound that Magdalena didn't even know she had. But unfortunately, that didn't help for very long, because just 4 days after the crash, Magdalena was getting so bad that she knew she was going to die. So rather than holding her children back, she told Leslie, "Stay alive and get out of here, leave me." And that's exactly what she did. Their mom passed away, and over the next few days, between keeping her siblings alive, keeping herself alive, Leslie took all of the skills that she learned as a little girl from her indigenous tribe and she put them to use. And through all the pain, all the hunger, all the bugs, she would guide her 3 younger siblings while carrying her 11-month-old sister in her arms over 15 miles per day, heading east towards the sun and following the river. She would hunt for edible berries and fruits that were really high in nutrients and make sure that they weren't poisonous. She'd mix water and cassava flour that was really high in protein and feed it to her siblings. And for the baby, she would grab a leaf, form it into a funnel, and use it as a makeshift baby bottle so that way it can go straight into her mouth. Like, this little girl is 11 years old and she is so knowledgeable of her home and forest that she is using all its resources to keep them all alive. I have no words. So by this point, it's been almost 16 days since the plane crashed, and Leslie is on high alert because every few days she would see and hear people out in the distance, but instead of yelling, we're here, over here. She'd go and hide in the trees. And if you're wondering why doesn't she want to be rescued? Well, think about it. Her mom and stepfather ran away from their village because of rebels who were threatening to hurt them. So naturally, she doesn't trust anyone, even if that means staying out there in this jungle for a little longer. But what she didn't know is that all of those people walking around far out in the distance were soldiers and indigenous tribes working together to find them. For 16 days, these soldiers were using their technology, their helicopters, their night vision goggles to search over top of the jungle, while the indigenous tribes grouped together using prayers, their spiritual connection to the forest, and their knowledge of the wildlife to walk over 20 miles every single day in hopes of finding something, anything. And then one day, they did. They see something on the ground and it's very colorful, at least comparing it to the brown dirt that they're surrounded by. And as they get closer and closer, they come to realize it's a pink baby bottle. And right next to it was a half-eaten apple. And just a few yards away, camouflaging in the distance, was a plane. The plane, in the same horrifying position, surrounded by broken trees everywhere. I mean, this is a huge step forward because now they know where to go from. Except when you really think about it, to finally find the crash site also meant finding the leftover bodies of Magdalena and the 2 pilots. And I can't even think about what was going through their heads because on top of all of this, they cannot find the kids. I mean, the baby bottle and the half-eaten apple are yards away. And then there's footprints leading away from the crash site, but still, there's no bodies of the kids anywhere. So that could only mean one thing. They're alive. And oh my gosh, this gave those searchers a newfound hope because now they're going even harder. Like to the point where they brought in a search dog so that it can get accustomed to their scents and maybe bring them closer. But after a few days, the dog disappears. And I can't even imagine how infuriating that must be. The dog was supposed to help find them, and instead it just added to the list of things they needed to find. But just to put a smile on your face, it turns out the dog did find them all on its own. So now Leslie, Soleini, Tian, the baby, after weeks of isolation, they finally had some furry company just to make them feel a little better. But unfortunately, just a few days later, the dog ran off again and has never been found to this day. Although I will say his paw prints were a really big reason as to why the searchers were able to get closer and closer to the kids. But the main reason is actually pretty shocking because like I mentioned earlier, indigenous people are really big in spirituality and believing that the forest, the trees, the plants, they all speak to them in their own language. So one day, a shaman named El Rubio took ayahuasca, which is basically a natural type of hallucinogenic that alters your senses and way of thinking. So for El Rubio, his psyche took him to the children. He said that his visions were clear as day and he knew exactly where to find them. So he went on and told 3 soldiers, go this direction and only this direction. And that's exactly what they did. They walked for over 50 meters until all of a sudden they stop and they hear something in the distance. They're looking around like, what is that noise? It's like squeaky but not squeaky. So as they keep walking and getting closer and closer to figure out what this is, all of a sudden they see it. It turned out to be 11-month-old baby Kristen crying in Leslie's arms. And right next to them were the 2 other siblings wrapped in banana leaves to protect them from all the bugs. I mean, these images speak volumes. You can literally feel what they went through. And so they immediately ran to them saying, it's okay, you're safe now. We're part of the indigenous tribe and we have been looking for you for weeks. Oh my god, I cannot believe how resilient these children are. It honestly makes me want to cry. And so finally, on June 9th, after 40 dreadful, dangerous, life-threatening days in the Amazon forest, they were lifted into the air by a helicopter and transferred over to a hospital where they stayed for months until they gained their strength back. But as of right now, it still isn't known, or at least I couldn't figure out who is going to gain custody of them. But all I can pray for is that they have a well-deserving, happy life. And same for all of you. I love you guys so much. I will see you in my next video. Mwah, group hug.
The injuries from her murder were so catastrophic that the investigators compared them to someone who had been hit by a car. Someone managed to inflict that brutality with their own bare hands. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Julie Jones. In her early life, Julie Margaret Jones was brought up in Abergele, Wales, where she lived with her parents and 3 siblings. At school, Julie was very popular, she had lots of friends, and she was really smart. She managed to leave school with a couple of O-levels under her belt. She was very sporty, she was an avid netball player, and she played for the school team where she was described as the star. She was very lively, energetic, she absolutely loved to put on a performance, singing and dancing. Julie was also very affectionate. Teresa would describe that if she was feeling a little bit down in the dumps and needed cheering up, Julie would sit on her knee, giving her the biggest cuddle ever, and told her mum how much she loved her. After her parents separated, 17-year-old Julie decided to move from Wales up to Bury in Manchester with her mother Teresa, who was working as a lollipop lady. To start off, everything was great, normal and happy. Julie would even go on to have 2 children, 2 sons who she named Dale and Josh. However, as Teresa described it, Julie's life began to spiral out of control. She would get in with the wrong crowd and she would end up moving to Ann Court in Manchester, which is a more central area. She had started abusing hard drugs, including heroin and so much more, and in order to fund this addiction, she had turned to sex work. On the evening of Friday the 26th of June 1998, 32-year-old Julie left her home in Ann Court ready to go out for a night of work. She would frequent the Whalley Range and Minsell Street area to meet her clients, to meet the men. That night she was seen getting in and out of several cars, going off and doing her work, then returning, then meeting another client. The last sighting of Julie was her getting into a car, and then she disappeared. When Julie didn't return back home when she was supposed to, her housemate reported her missing to the police. 6 days later, on the 3rd of July, a dog walker who was out and about near the old Smithfield Market area, which now is a part of the Northern Quarter. I'm pretty sure there are luxury apartments built there, but back then it was a very desolate part of the city. He would discover the body of Julie Jones. She was found completely naked and wrapped up in a carpet. The injuries that were inflicted on Julie were absolutely horrific and barbaric. The injuries were compared to someone who had been hit by a car or jumped off a tall building. Julie's autopsy would show that she had severe crushing wounds to her ribs and internal organs. All of her ribs were broken, and the internal injuries inflicted to her organs caused catastrophic bleeding. Some monster had either been ferociously stamping on Julie or physically jumping up and down on her in order to inflict these injuries. During the investigation into her murder, the investigators became pretty confident that the site where Julie was found wasn't where she was murdered. She was murdered elsewhere, and then her body was dumped near the old Smithfield Market. Both her clothes and all of the jewellery that she had been wearing that night have never been recovered. At the time, a £10,000 reward was put out for information leading to an arrest, and off the back of this, they actually got several leads. 7 people in total were arrested. However, no charges were ever brought against them, and they were all released. Detectives spoke to over 300 people. However, none of these statements led them any closer to discovering who had murdered Julie. And with that, her case went cold. In 2018, so 20 years after her barbaric murder, Julie's case was finally being looked into again as a cold case. Thanks to all the advances in DNA technology, investigators were able to extract a DNA profile from some of their evidence. A profile that they believe might help them crack the case. I gather that it's already been put through the national database and that there were no matches on there, because surely that's the first thing that the investigators did. But no matches must have came up. All that the police need now is someone to come forward with information, with a name, give them someone to compare this DNA to. As of right now, the murder of Julie Jones is still unsolved. There is a £50,000 reward for information leading to an arrest.
Go back, Daddy. She cannot swim. That is what a 2-year-old told her own father after watching him throw his little sister over a bridge. And this psychotic dad's name is Arthur Freeman, but let's just hope that he is never a free man again. He's about 35 years old, living in Australia with his wife Peta, and together they have 3 kids. Benjamin is 7 years old, Darcy is 4, and little baby Jonathan is just 2 years old. And on paper, he looks like dad of the year. He plays sports with the boys. He takes Darcy to ballet practice. He shows up for all of these little moments. But then everything changed when Arthur lost his job and was really struggling to find a new one. But thankfully, Peta had a really good career, and she eventually became the breadwinner of the house, paying all of the bills. So Arthur just ends up being a stay-at-home dad, and listen, plenty of men can handle that role perfectly fine, although I don't think he was one of them. He became so moody, aggressive, and bitter, to the point where he literally sucked the life out of his relationship. And he wasn't just mean to Peta, he was harsh to the kids as well. So by 2007, up and Peta's like, I'm done, I want a divorce. And Arthur did not take that very well. He wanted to talk it out, but instead of like talking, he just snapped. He starts screaming at her, getting all angry, and Peta's like, congratulations, you just gave me exhibit A as to why I'm leaving you in the first place. But Arthur gets so angry, he allegedly grabs baby Jonathan, who's barely 2, and tries to throw him into a lit fireplace. Yes, a lit fireplace. Peta freaks out and goes full on mama bear. She's biting at him, trying to loosen his grip. And Peta's mom, who was also in the house, hears all this chaos and rushes in to help. She grabs a stroller and smashes it into Arthur's back. And between being bitten all over and then hit with a stroller, Arthur finally lets go. Peta grabs Jonathan and the police are eventually called. But the whole time they're getting questioned by these investigators, Arthur is like, no, I would never hurt my kids. I just lost my temper. And in that moment, Peta really wanted to believe him because technically, up until that night, he'd never been violent before. But thankfully, she stood her ground and still filed for a domestic dispute because from that point on, there was honestly no saving that marriage. So by 2008, the divorce was finalized and Arthur was living out on his own. He and Peta agreed to share custody of the kids, 3 days on, 3 days off. And notice how I said agree, because this wasn't some legal court-ordered custody. This was just a verbal agreement between the both of them. But for some reason, Peta wasn't comfortable. Like, yes, that's their dad, but something in her gut told her her kids are not safe with that man. And here's where people always ask, well, why didn't she just go to the police? Okay, let's pause. She had gone to the police before. Remember the fireplace incident? Police showed up, they logged it, Arthur said sorry, end of story. Reality check, sometimes police aren't the heroes in every situation. Like, by that point, Arthur hadn't actually hurt the kid. Was he terrifying? Yes. Dangerous? Absolutely. But legally, no child was hurt. So to the police, it was just a domestic dispute. And if she tried calling and going back again with no new evidence, it would have just been another he said, she said situation. And we already know how that goes. So instead, she goes to doctors because in Australia, doctors are mandated reporters. That basically means if they believe a child is in danger, then by law, they have to report it. So she goes to 3 different doctors and tells each of them, I don't feel safe. I think Arthur hurt the kids. And the doctors are like, I don't think they're in any imminent danger. Mind you, they said that because they'd all seen Arthur with the kids and he looked fine. He played the part, he smiled, he was gentle. So in their eyes, he was not violent. Which has me questioning, like, are we serious right now? Since when is he looks fine in public the gold standard for safety? Do abusers walk around in villain costumes twirling their mustaches? No, they always play the part. So because Arthur could fake being loving for like 10 minutes, Peta's concerns went nowhere. But Peta was not taking no for an answer, and so she takes all of her concerns to court, hoping that she can take full custody of the kids. And the court tells her, in order to do that, a psychologist has to give everyone a professional evaluation. Everyone meeting Peta, Arthur, the kids, and both sides of the family. They all had to be there so they can figure out what was best for the children. And let me tell you, this man couldn't have sabotaged himself more even if he tried. First of all, on the day of the evaluation, he's late. Like, bro, this is about your children. Set an alarm. Then when he finally arrives, does he sit quietly and let people speak? Absolutely not. He interrupts everyone. With every single question the psychologist asked, Arthur just jumps in, he talks over them and doesn't let anyone answer. And the whole time, the kids are sitting there just getting more and more upset. Because imagine, you're already upset, your parents are fighting over you, and your dad is literally arguing with the air. Like, the psychologist literally wrote in his notes, Arthur's behavior caused the children to be more distressed than they needed to be. And when the report finally comes in, the psychologist says, yes, Arthur does seem to love his kids, but he also has chronic personality disorder and interpersonal problems. Translation, this man is a nightmare to deal with. So the psychologist recommends that Peta should get full custody while Arthur can see the kids on every other weekend. And the judges agree. But Arthur, he loses it. I mean, he basically went from equal custody to maybe seeing his kids 4 days a month. He runs to his father like, they set me up, I lost everything. Buddy, no, you did not lose everything. You just proved in front of a professional why you are a walking red flag. But instead of taking accountability, instead of thinking, how can I do better so I can be there for my kids, he decides the only way to win is to get revenge on Peta. So the night after the court's decision, Peta agrees to let the kids stay with Arthur and his parents. But hold up, before anybody comes at Peta asking, why on earth would she let that happen if she was scared? Let me explain so we don't victim blame a woman who was literally just doing everything she could. First of all, like I said, Arthur wasn't alone. He was at his parents' house and Peta trusted them. Secondly, Arthur technically still has rights to see them. The judge didn't just rip away his custody completely. So if Peta tried to say, nope, they're mine, she could technically get in trouble for that. That's not how the system works. And third of all, this one breaks my heart, but she is still a mom who wanted her kids to have their dad. And besides, the plan was pretty simple. She would just pick them up the next day at school. And it just so happened to be Darcy's first day at school, so they both wanted to be there. They both wanted to watch their little girl walk into the classroom for the very first time. Which is beautiful, right? That's what co-parenting should be like. Except Arthur had other plans, because that next morning, January 29th, 2009, he loads the kids into the car. But instead of driving them to school, instead of taking Darcy to her very first day of class, he drives them to Westgate Bridge. And somewhere in the middle of this drive, PETA calls him, because at this point it's late, almost 9 o'clock in the morning, and Darcy is about to miss her big moment. And so she is annoyed, which valid. I'd be furious if my kid were late on their very first day of school. That is a milestone that you do not mess with. And do you want to know what Arthur says to her? Say goodbye to your children. And then he hangs up. And PETA, this poor woman, she knows he means it. She panics and rushes to the police station and tells them that her crazy ex-husband just threatened to hurt her kids. And while she's begging these officers to do anything, it was already too late. Arthur drove to the highest point of the bridge. He calmly pulls over to the emergency lane and he tells little Darcy to unbuckle herself. And of course she does. I mean, she's 4 years old, and when your dad tells you to do something, your first thought isn't gonna be, oh, he's gonna unalive me. So she reaches her arms up, expecting like a hug or maybe to be carried like always. But instead, he puts her on the ground and he grabs her hand and very calmly and slowly walks towards the railing of the bridge. And then, without any hesitation or even second guessing himself, he just lifts her over top of the railing. He faces her towards him and just lets go, sending his 4-year-old daughter plummeting down 190 feet into a river. And then, like nothing happened, like he didn't just destroy his entire family in that single moment, Arthur turns around, walks back towards his car, gets in, and drives off. Meanwhile, Benjamin, who is only 7 years old, is in the back seat screaming and crying, begging his dad to go back, saying over and over, "Go back, daddy, she cannot swim, please go back." Like, he's so young, he doesn't even understand death yet. All he knows is that his little sister is in trouble and she needs help. But Arthur just keeps driving, ignoring his son's pleas and leaving his daughter behind. Meanwhile, the drivers that were on the bridge saw everything and they slammed on their brakes. People are jumping out of the cars, running to the railings and screaming that this man just threw a little girl over the bridge. And within minutes, police boats are rushing into the river, hoping to find her somewhere in the water. And 15 agonizing minutes later, they pull her out of the water, and by some miracle, she is still alive. Unconscious, but with a very faint pulse. Paramedics throw everything they have at her. They're working on her little body for over an hour long, just so that they can stabilize her enough so she can be airlifted to a nearby hospital. And while all of this is happening, Arthur drives straight to the same courthouse that he lost custody of his kids to. He goes ahead and parks, very neatly by the way, and puts money into the meter, totally casual, which has me like, what? You're following parking rules after unaliving your daughter? Bro, get this man off my screen. He then takes Jonathan and Benjamin into the courthouse, and once he's inside, he walks straight to the security and says, "Take them." The guard hesitates because that's a strange request, but something in his gut is telling him to take them. And the second those boys are out of his arms, Arthur just collapses to the ground. He's sobbing uncontrollably right there in the courthouse lobby. Court staff immediately rush over, trying to comfort him, completely clueless to what he's just done. They're patting his back, saying, "Oh, don't worry, it'll be okay." Meanwhile, police are already connecting the dots from the bridge. The witness calls, the car description, the timeline is all pointing directly to Arthur. And eventually, right there in the courthouse, Arthur Freeman is arrested. And that's also when PETA, who is still at the police station, hears the news of what Arthur has just done. The 911 calls, the bridge, the little girl in the water. I mean, it hit her all at once. Like, it's her worst nightmare come true. PETA is rushed across the city to the hospital, and she is just praying the whole way that maybe, just maybe, her little girl will survive this. That maybe the doctors will tell her it's bad, but not hopeless. But when she gets there, she does not get a miracle. She doesn't even get hope. She has to make the single most devastating decision no parent should ever face. She has to agree to let them take Darcy off of life support because her little girl is gone. And the injuries just proved how brutal it really was. Darcy's autopsy showed massive trauma consistent with that great height. Her brain was swollen. I mean, the damage was catastrophic and permanent. The doctor said that she suffered a severe hypoxic brain injury, and that means that her brain was starved of oxygen. So even if her body had survived, her brain stood no chance. And that's the reality PETA was left with. Her little girl's life was stolen in the cruelest way possible, while Arthur sat in his prison cell acting like he was the victim the whole time. This man actually disgusts me, like that was his daughter. So when it finally came time for his trial in 2011, 2 years later, this man had the audacity to stand up there and plead not guilty. Not guilty after that phone call he left PETA, after the witnesses seeing a little girl being pushed off a bridge, after his own son was screaming, "She can't swim." I don't even know what to say. He tried to hide it all behind a mental illness defense, claiming that he didn't know what he was actually doing, that he acted without a conscious thought, and that he just blacked out and somehow ended up dropping his daughter off of a bridge. But thankfully, the court was not buying it, and neither were the experts. One psychiatrist in particular, named Yvonne Skinner, who had dealt with more than 80 cases of parents children, told the jury straight up that Arthur's actions were deliberate, conscious, and absolutely calculated. She called it what it really was: spousal revenge. She said parents like Arthur don't see the child as a problem, they see the child as a weapon, and then they use them to inflict the deepest possible pain on the other parent. And honestly, you don't need a degree to see that, because Arthur literally told PETA over the phone to say goodbye, which is as clear as intent gets. So the jury sat with all of this evidence, and after 5 long days of deliberation, they came back with the unanimous decision that this man is obviously guilty. Arthur Freeman was sentenced to life in prison with a maximum of 32 years, meaning the earliest he could ever walk free is by January 2041, which by then he'll be like 67 years old. And honestly, I hope those prison walls eat him alive. I hope every time he closes his eyes, Darcy's face is right there. I don't know, it just breaks my heart to know that PETA and those 2 boys have to deal with the outcome of this suffering. That's all I have for today. Please take care of yourself, you guys. I love you. Mwah. Group hug.